Happy to be talking with you, and I'm also from Mississippi. I wanted to start there. I know you've been to the old University of Southern Miss, right?
Right. Yeah, I was there
Yes.
for 12 years.
Okay, great, great. Yeah, I'm from Clinton, Mississippi, which is like an hour and a half away. But I went to Mississippi College for my undergrad, and I went to Jackson State for my master's, and now I'm here in University of Kansas getting a PhD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Good.
So tell me a bit about yourself, if you don't mind, and how you came to this project, Digital Atlas.
Well, I'll give you the shortest version possible. I'm a legal and constitutional historian by training, and in fact, I continue to publish there. I've just done 3 or 4 books in the last 10 years in that area. I'm about to come out with another one. But I founded a center when I came here from Southern Miss. I founded a center called the Polis Center, which sought to connect community and the academy in some creative and innovative ways. And we adopted GIS as our technology of choice very early on. But here, 15 or 20 years into the development of the center, and the center has been very successful. We've done about $100 million worth of grants and contracts over the past 30 years, working in a variety of different areas. But it became clear to me that even though I had created and was leading a center that was very strong in GIS, that I had done nothing as a historian to apply that technology to historical questions, many of which ignored space or ignored location. And I thought that there was a lot of richness there that could be explored. And about the same time, and this would have been the late 1990s, I was contacted by a distinguished Buddhist scholar named Louis Lancaster, who taught at the University of California at Berkeley. And he had gotten some grant money to think about how it was that this technology could be applied, especially in the creation of cultural atlas. And he asked would I participate, and I was happy to do so. And there I became acquainted with a variety of mostly geographers, but some historians, and quite a lot of people within GI science who were willing to think about the kinds of issues that were raised by the application of what in fact was a very precision-focused technology to an imprecise discipline or set of disciplines in the humanities.
Right.
This was called the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative. And for a period of about 10 years, this association, and it was a rather loose association, although we did have a board of directors of which I was part, or an executive board, that we would meet 2 or 3 times a year at varying locations, oftentimes in Asia, where there was quite a lot of interest in this. And while ICAI, as it was called, for short, ultimately ended its natural life. It was what led me to projects such as the Digital Atlas of American Religion, which with some colleagues at West Virginia University and Florida State University, we had formed at that point a virtual center for spatial humanities to do, mainly because we were convinced, this would have been around 2005 or 2006, we were convinced that GIS was not a good technology as it existed to apply to historical questions or to questions in the humanities, that there needed to be something more than that. The GIS was part of the solution, but by no means all of the solution. It just raised too many epistemological questions, let alone methodological ones. So, but we did think that this digital atlas would allow us to explore some of the ways we could create add-ons to GIS as it existed to allow us to explore different dimensions, different spatial dimensions within a framework that for which we knew that there was a fair amount of data available. And here the problem was that it had been, these religion data had been collected over a period of time, but reported only at the county level. Mm-hmm. And using GIS, that meant when you mapped it and using the default mechanism of chloropleth maps, all you saw was the dominant religion's presence in any county. And it became clear in looking at that while that was helpful at one level, it was especially unhelpful in understanding something about religious diversity within any county. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what our challenge was. How do we show that religious diversity within a mapping framework that only showed dominance, or largest? To make that more concrete, the county that I'm in now, or that Indiana University, Indianapolis is in now, is Marion County. Mm-hmm. Marion County has about 95 different faith traditions. Catholics constitute the largest, but it's only 18%. And yet the county shows up as Catholic, predominantly Catholic. Of course, that's clearly misleading. But we applied to NEH and got a grant that allows us to explore this, and that was the result of DAR. I mean, that's where DAR comes from, although that's not until the early, I think 2011 or 12 was when we did that. But what had emerged from that entire lead-up to that point was a definition of what spatial humanities were. And in fact, we, the three of us, actually defined the field. We did so in a publication in a book in 2010 called The Spatial Humanities. It's the first time that appears in any kind of book. It tried to sketch out the contours of the field and explain how it was that it began to emerge. At that time, all of this was called historical GIS. Historical GIS was privileging the tool and not the approach. So that's why we rejected that as a term and went to the spatial humanities. We got further NEH grants. We did an advanced seminar in the spatial humanities where we brought young scholars from Europe and America to Indianapolis to think with us for about 3 weeks and to create some understandings of what it was that spatial. What were some of the tools that spatial humanities could begin to use and how to achieve what we wanted? We started a series with Indiana University Press called the Indiana University Press Series on Spatial Humanities, of which there are now 10 publications. We began to experiment with something called deep mapping. We published a book in 2015 that talks about deep mapping and spatial narratives. And then we're coming out with another book next year, it looks like. I don't think it's going to be out this year, called Deep Mapping, that really does focus on the theoretical foundations and practical applications of this new approach. The thing that is most pleasing to us is that now, even though you may not have heard of it, spatial humanities is one of the rubrics that National Endowment for the Humanities uses, National Science Foundation uses, the American Association of Geographers, and a number of other professional groups use to express what it is that this is. No, historical GIS has kind of fallen by the wayside. So it's pleasing to me to see that there has in fact been, over the last 10 years, kind of a birth of a new field, or at least a subfield, called spatial humanities. And it really is quite attractive and a quite attractive rubric across the world. Last year I gave 7 keynote speeches, 4 of them in Europe and 3 of them in Asia, just on this particular point, and especially exploring deep mapping as the approach that accommodates humanities data most effectively. There's a much longer story behind all that. I tried to tell the shortest version I could.
No, I appreciate it. And you hit a lot of the questions I already had about this, so that worked out perfectly. Because I was reading the introduction of deep maps and spatial narratives, I am interested in this idea that narrative is essential to what you're doing. So could you talk a little bit about how, I guess, there was this concept that time was being left out of the GIS method, right? So it was kind of hard to like track time with culture and space and place together. So could you talk about how the spatial narrative through spatial humanities responds to that need?
Well, it tries to do it in something of a hybrid fashion, and I must confess that it's a much more difficult thing to accomplish than what I would have imagined 3 or 5 years ago. Part of it because the technologies we still have, and GIS has improved quite a lot. It is trying to accommodate time in ways that it never did before. Mm-hmm. But it still insists on precise data, which is, of course, not going to be possible when you're dealing with humanities material and humanities information. And so the issue becomes, I think, how within the technology can we understand, and I think our concern is not about space as much as it is about place. Space is an abstraction. Place is the thing the humanists are interested in. Yes, because, as you know, Eudora Welty, one of our Mississippians, said, it's place that gives us our identity. It's one of the things that we cling to when we come to define ourselves. So place is really important, but place means so many different things, and it doesn't have any firm temporal markers. When I think of the place of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where I was for 12 years, then that exists for me now not just as a physical location, not just as a civil jurisdiction, not just as a place with history, but it exists in a memory that becomes increasingly hazy the further I move away from it in time. Mm-hmm. But it's still very powerful emotionally to me because of the associations that I had there. Most of them positive, but some of them, of course, not. So I think that the issue becomes how do you use the technology to capture that? How do you use the technology to pull all of those things together and allow us to understand that while Hattiesburg has a physical geography that we can know that place physically, mm-hmm. we can know that space physically, we can know that space in terms of its governmental boundaries, and we can know all the functions associated with that thing. We can know its history, and that we can also know its identity through our either individual or collective memories. How is it that we can manage that effectively within the technology? Because those are all multiple facets of the same phenomenon, of the same thing. And they are all blend together with us when we use the term Hattiesburg, mm-hmm. or any particular place that we're interested in. So, and then how can you use that, recognizing that part of the power of the technology is not just simply the ability to manage a lot of these expressions simultaneously, but ultimately to visualize them in a way that allows us to see the different facets. Now, that's the challenge, I think. How do we do that? And then how do we communicate that still within the kind of narrative framework that we as scholars are going to always use to attribute meaning to something? Because the problem with the narrative frameworks that we use is they're all linear. They may, within that linearity, we may go back and forth, but it's still kind of presenting something from A to B to C. It has that kind of logical framework, unless you're totally free text, and then you become kind of lost in what's trying to be said. So I think the issue is how do you take these two things and pull them together, recognizing that they are dependent upon each other, that we really can't think about place or talk about place in all of its complexity just through the power of words alone. That because each of those words call up for us I'm pretty sure that this is what neurobiologists tell us now, and our psychologists and those people who study the workings of the mind, that they're always calling up visual images anyway. But that's the basic way we understand the world. And so how do we link those two in a way that is dynamic, that allows for the fluidity that we recognize as part of the world in which we live, because we don't progress in our thinking or in our actions very logically from point A to point B to point C to point D, right?
Right.
We're constantly moving around within that and trying to figure out things. And so part of what we're trying to do here is to figure out how can technology both replicate us a little bit too much of that. It's too deterministic. That's not what we're trying to do. But how does it help us to express that better so that we can see all of those facets, and we can remember that when talking about one of those facets, those other facets of that place are always present. And it's just kind of a way in which we try to deal with them as much as we can at one time, recognizing that ultimately when we put it into words, we really still are back into a linear frame.
Awesome. Very interesting. It's interesting too, like building a whole new discipline or subdiscipline. So as you were going through this process, as you were even working with the Polis Center and this Digital Atlas of America, how did like collaborations help you, even with kind of like the ideological building, or the disciplinary and interdisciplinary process? Like, what interdisciplinary processes were enveloped in this process?
Yeah, well, I think this is for me, it's been one of the most interesting and actually one of the most fun parts of the work that I've been doing in the spatial humanities over the past 10, 15, or 20 years. And that is that it reminds you that we all in our disciplines have different ways to approach knowledge. And that we in the humanities privilege one way, those in the geographic information sciences privilege another way. But in fact, each of them are perfectly valid ways, and they're each interesting for what they reveal and for what their limits are. So, I was Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Southern Miss, and that was one of the things I actually most enjoyed about the work that I did. I was in contact with 50 departments and thus 50 different disciplines, and that became real clear to me at that point, and this experience has reinforced that. Now the challenge is recognizing that each of those disciplines have different vocabularies. And of course, one of the ways in which computer scientists in the past have tried to approach this is by building these elaborate ontologies, and humanists fell into that. And I'm not suggesting that ontologies aren't important, they are. But in fact, it's not the Holy Grail. And in fact, computing science, and Polis, I should mention this, Polis is, as a center, we've been in the liberal arts, but we are now moving to informatics and computing, the School of Informatics and Computing, because what's clear is that computing has recognized that there are these issues out there, and so they've created entirely new ways of approaching that kind of hybridity and complexity that is much more reflective of how we experience the world than kind of putting things into frames by creating an order that in fact doesn't exist anywhere except within the computer. So part of what I think, you're right, the challenge is how do you create this how do you create this vocabulary that allows you to exchange ideas effectively and quickly? And how do you then build a collaborative framework that allows you to work together on that? And I'll be honest with you, I think the real issue here is, and I think it's true for actually any kind of collaboration, you have to find people you like to work with and who will approach the problem with the same respect for you that you're going to bring to them. And times in the humanities, we either adopt a defensive posture, because I'm not even sure that we understand ourselves or think ourselves or we are convinced completely that what we do is really worthwhile, because we're such a market-based society. And it's hard to attach dollar value to that, even though all of us, I think, would argue, and I think legitimately, that what the humanities does is helps us to understand something that is much more essentially human, than does a mere exchange of goods or some sort of transactional framework for explaining things. But I think the real issue does become, how do you find people who you like? I mean, because ultimately, Chris, and this I think, I found this in the work that we do, which is highly collaborative at all levels. We work a lot with nonprofits and governments, and at all three levels of national, state, and local. We work with faith-based groups. We work with just a lot of people, and every one of those things comes down to how successful can we be in building a relationship. Because it is that relationship that ultimately allows us to find the language that we need, that allows us to find the commonality that we need to be able to advance our work. I know it kind of sounds sappy, but in fact, I think that the longer I'm at this, the more I think that's really the core of it.
That's very true. I mean, that's definitely the case. I just have about two more questions. So when it comes to basically the digital atlas of American religion, how did you determine the three categories in particular: the historic religious data, religious practices and beliefs, and historic U.S. census in particular? How did you end up with those categories as measuring sticks, basically?
Well, I mean, the census and the historic data on religion were the two data sets that we really started with. I think the innovation from a disciplinary standpoint comes in the way that we categorize those faith traditions and group them, because you can't, I mean, the U.S. has, 700, 800 different faith traditions. You can't manage all of that within a visual framework that allows you to get any meaning out of it. And so, but you can realize that these, we can call them denominations of these traditions, in fact, do group themselves, or you can find groupings for them effectively within their ecclesiastical structure, their theological beliefs, their practices, any number of different ways you can do that. And here, it wasn't that we at Polis had any special purchase on that. Rather, it was John Corrigan, who is the distinguished professor of religion at Florida State, and who had been part of this EKI process that I mentioned to you. That's where I first got to know John. That John recognized that this was one of the ways in which we can. It's not the only way by any means, but it was the way that we thought made most sense and that we could handle most effective within the technologies that were available to us. And so it was really his contribution to the project, because he's not a technologist by any means, but it was his contribution to the project to create this framework, this intellectual framework about religion that allowed us to manage it effectively within and to link it effectively to the data sets that we had, and to manage it effectively within the technologies.
Awesome. And also with the I guess the future of maybe even this project, but I'm really more interested in my project in particular, right? Because I am building a map. Obviously, it's not as complex, or it's not a deep mapping, I don't think. but with my map, it's what I'm calling a genre ecology, or what is called a genre ecology. So with genre theory, we're including like these spatial elements. So like with me studying early African American religion, I'm looking at, the space of the plantation, but I'm also looking at how it has changed over time. So what advice or whatever you would give to people who are interested in merging spatial humanities and something like religion or spirituality together? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do is to recognize that the period in which you're interested, the data on religion is incredibly poor, and oftentimes just not existent in any meaningful way.
Right.
Much of what you're going to be working with, at least as I understand, is going to be more in the area of folklore.
Yes.
And in oral histories, than it will be, because you won't even find it. I don't think you're not going to find many contemporary practices that you'll be able to link authoritatively to a record, because of that record is primarily oral.
Right.
So you might think about not even imagining GIS as your expression, except for the kind of very simple GIS where you want to locate a practice within whatever context it appears, and that context may be demographic, it may be ethnographic. I don't know what the context is, but you can represent some of that, because those contexts most often have geographical dimensions, and that's what GIS is good for. But you might think about how it is that you look at visualizations, other kind of visualizations, as a way to capture what you're trying to do, because those visualizations might lead you to a different perspective that is still spatial, but it's just not GIS spatial. I'm gonna give you a person whose work I'm gonna encourage you to look at, because I think he's very creative in this. His name is Charles Travis, and he is a geographer. I met him first at Trinity College when I gave a lecture there in Dublin, and but he is now at University of Dallas, at University of Texas. I think it's in Arlington. Maybe it's North Texas. You can look him up. I'm sure you'll find him. But I'm going to point to a couple of works that he's done that I think, or one work especially, that I think is really evocative and suggestive of what's possible here. He did when he was in Dublin, everybody, of course, is a Joycean scholar, whether they're in literature or not. Right. Just simply because of the economic impact of Bloomsday and other things. Well, Travis recognized, as from his reading of Joyce, as well as from his looking at what scholars had said about Ulysses, that the book Ulysses is in fact not simply the wanderings of a modern-day Ulysses, but rather it's also guided by a travel through Dante's Inferno. That, in fact, Dante influences Joyce a lot in terms of this notion of rings and circles. So what Travis did was he took the route that Leopold Bloom travels through Dublin on, June the 16th, I think, and he overlays that with Dante's Inferno, so that you get the sense that Bloom is not simply wandering through physical Dublin; he's wandering through metaphorical hell, or hell in the sense not of the kind of evangelical Christian view of it, but rather this complex set of circumstances in which human actions have consequences that are oftentimes not positive. They're negative, and so. But he has some remarkable illustrations, and you by looking at them, you'll recognize that what he's done there is reminded us that Bloom is walking through a physical space that anybody can walk through, but he's also traversing another world, a metaphorical world, and that it's just an interesting way to think about the two spatial configurations, because this metaphorical world has a spatial dimension as well.
Right.
I mean, you read Dante and you know that it's spatial. So it brings those two together. So you might look at Travis's work. I found his work to be really fascinating in the way he's able to blend different types of technologies and different types of visualizations, much more, I think, in an evocative way than in a definitive way. And of course, we're always looking to use the technology to give us the answer. And what Travis recognizes that most times for the humanities, what the technologies can help us do best is to do things, is to help us ask a different kind of question.
That's so great. Thank you so much for this. I don't want to hold you so long. I know you have to go soon. But yeah, I appreciate it. And this was a really insightful conversation on my end, at least. So thank you again.
Oh, good. Well, I'm delighted it was helpful, and good luck with you on your defense of your prospectus, and good luck with the rest of your studies. You're entering a very interesting time, and just remember that you'll be discouraged many times along the way, but keep plugging at it. As we all discover, you will get through it.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
Sure. All right.
Bye-bye.
Good.